Bring in our political panel, Simon Banks and Parnell Palm McGuinness. Great to see you both. Parnell, what do you make of the visit? A very warm welcome so far for Premier Li Qiang.
It's great, and it's just what the government needs at the moment, and it is what in Australia's best interests to have a warm relationship, at least above the line, between the two leaders. Of course, you know, we have to hope that behind the scenes, the serious issues of espionage and of foreign influence and other issues like that are being raised. But at the same time, it is important that these top-line cordial relations are visibly had, and to keep the lines of communication open with China.
Yep. Exactly, but it's not without its difficulties, is it, Simon Banks, from imprisoned Australians to, as Parnell rightly points out, the cyber espionage?
Yeah, and of course there are regional and geostrategic issues that they'll be talking about as well. And Australia and China aren't aligned on all of these issues, but our trade relationship is nonetheless the most significant one that we've got. So look, we need to be able to improve that relationship. Obviously, we've seen with the progress that's been made about resolving some of those trade issues. Over the last 2 years, there's been very good progress in relation to those. But as Pam said, like we just cannot assume that the relationship will be stable and safe. There are clearly going to be difficult issues in the relationship in the years ahead. But as I constantly say, Kieran, it's better for us to jaw than to war.
Yeah, that's the famous phrase indeed, and you've got those images there live from Parliament House. You can see a few officials mingling, a couple of parliamentary broadcast staffers, as well as you see the preparations now being finalised for this ceremony. We'll have all of it live for you, followed by some remarks. And Parnell, the thing is, and this is what I found intriguing, speaking to the former ambassador, Jeff Raby, former ambassador to Beijing, he said the trade relationship had grown massively in the 7 years since the last official visit. So even when things have been rocky, the economic ties have remained strong and growing, even though some specific areas had been targeted with sanctions.
That's right. Sometimes these sanctions are really show sanctions, and there are other things going on behind the scenes that we don't see, that aren't as visible. So, I mean, of course, we have a lot of Chinese expats living in Sydney, or in Australia. We have a lot of people who now have families, who are permanent residents, who are citizens here, who still have ties back to China, and that promotes other kinds of exchange and growth. And so these ties exist, but of course we also have to be very careful, on the other hand, that China isn't using those ties to have nefarious influence on Australia, because they do also, you know, while it's beneficial on the trade side, they do have a tendency to use people living in Australia as pawns to get things done by threatening harm to their family back at home. So, you know, we must never lose sight of the fact that we're dealing with a dictatorship, with an authoritarian regime, but at the same time, we have to try and find ways to get along and have a healthy relationship that's as healthy as possible.
And according to a number of analysts in this space, Simon, China very keen to mend fences where they can in the Western world, particularly with big trading partners. With the prospect of a Donald Trump presidency looming, they could face massive tariffs themselves, and they need to have other options.
Look, I think that's right, but it'll be very interesting to see, obviously, what happens in the US presidential election, what goes on beyond that. Look, I think Parnell's points a couple of moments ago were spot on. Like, you know, this is a complex and difficult relationship, but a really critical one for the Australian economy. We should never compromise on our fundamental values when it comes to dealing with China, but you know, we do have really important ties, both commercial and our person-to-person ties between our two countries. And ultimately, I think this is one of the great roles that Australia has played throughout the last sort of 50 years in its relationship with China. No one doubts on either side of this whose side we are ultimately on, but we are always an important bridge, particularly between the Americans and the Chinese. I think that's where Australia as a middle power diplomacy plays a really important role in the world. We're never going to determine those issues ultimately between those two great superpowers, but we can play a role to help them understand and to navigate those differences in a way which keeps the world peaceful, and that is in everyone's interest.
Parnell, let's turn our attention to a couple of opinion polls out today. As we all know, politicians say that there's only one poll that counts and all that jazz, but we know that they all watch these numbers very, very closely indeed. And I think the coalition will be buoyed by seeing a few of the numbers, particularly when it comes to Mr Dutton's comparison with Anthony Albanese as preferred Prime Minister.
Yeah, I think we spoke about this on Friday. In fact, you know, this is, to my mind, the electorate really embracing the realism that Dutton is bringing to debates. And of course, you know, and Albanese won't like to see this at all. I don't think that it's going to make any difference in the party room at this stage. But of course, the Liberal Party will be very pleased to see this. It shows that the strategy of talking about the cost of living, talking about how energy plays into the cost of living, and keeping a focus on the things that are really hurting households and how we can address them in a realistic way could turn into a winning strategy for the Liberals. Perhaps not at this next election because that's going to be tight around certain seats, but definitely the election afterwards.